Here. All right. So we're so excited for all our panelists and for the audience to join us today, and everyone who will be watching this remotely and sort of in a distant future. So I'm going to introduce myself, and then have the panelists introduce themselves, and then we're going to go into a very fun conversation that I think will be like thought-provoking and actually, maybe move the conversation forward. So my name is Jennifer Aitley. I am many things, but in the context of this, I produce documentaries, including the Search for General So and the Emoji Story. But I do a lot of Zoom moderation, and I was asked to moderate and people from two different sides of my life. And in my other life, I also do a lot of work with innovation and publishing with a startup literary studio that I have called Plimpton. And the reason I'm in Santa Clara right now is I am also a member and the vice chair of the Unicode Emoji Subcommittee. So I help regulate the emojis on your phone and therefore think a lot about inclusion.
Sure. I'll go next. My name is Grace Lee. I'm an independent filmmaker based in Los Angeles. I work in both nonfiction and fiction, and have done other kinds of formats of storytelling, including interactive and things like that. But in the last few years, I've done a lot, mostly been kind of ensconced in documentary land. Last year, I had two series come out on PBS, the Asian American series, as well as And She Could Be Next, which is it was POV's first broadcast series. It looks at women of color transforming American politics as candidates and organizers. And yeah, so that's what I do. But these days I am now working on a podcast, and I'd love to talk a little bit more about that. Should I just go in?
After the intro,
all right.
and then we'll go into that. Yeah.
Okay. So I have a podcast called Viewers Like Us.
Yeah. It's really good, actually. Yeah.
Hi. So greetings from Scotland. I'm attending the TED Climate Conference to pitch the film that I'm working on that I'll share a little bit with you all. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Can't see you, but great that you're here. And my name is Sabrina Schmidt-Gordon. I'm a documentary filmmaker, primarily a producer and editor, AKA a predator. Most of the work that I do, I produce and edit, but sometimes I do one or the other. Let's see, most recently, I had a film called Quest that I produced that premiered at Sundance a few years ago and was broadcast on POV. I co-directed, produced, and edited a documentary about the poet and activist Sonia Sanchez called Bad Sonia Sanchez, which was also a broadcast on public television and nominated for several awards, including an Emmy, as was Quest. And I teach. I do impact. Yeah. Oh, Grace, I think we should put our bios in the chat for folks. Mm-hmm. Maybe that might be helpful too. But yeah, that's what I do. I'm a documentary filmmaker. Nice to see you all.
Hi, greetings from Montreal. My name is Richard. I'm a professor of English at McGill University. I work in this field of cultural analytics, where researchers, we use data computational methods to better understand cultural production. I spent the last few years researching racial inequality in book publishing and literary culture that culminated in a recent book called Redlining Culture, which was digested in the New York Times for a study of whiteness in the book industry. I'll be talking about that in a few minutes for this panel. And broadly, yeah, I study using a variety of methods, the media and culture industry. And more recently, I've been working with colleagues at Twitter and some colleagues at Netflix thinking about diversity and less toxic environments for content production on online platforms. So yeah, looking forward, and thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to learning more about your work. Thank you.
I'm going to kick it off by saying, I basically think that Grace wrote something, a piece of writing that's actually become extensively viral beyond maybe what she originally may have thought. And I was wondering if you can just tell us the story of how we're getting to this conversation right now.
As I said, I'm an independent filmmaker. And last year, sort of following all of the George Floyd uprisings, I was asked by the Ford Foundation, Just Films, if I wanted to write something about the future of documentary, a provocation. And since I had just come out of having two big series on PBS and sort of, observed PBS throughout my entire career as someone who has actually gotten a lot of opportunities through PBS, I wanted to write about this institution that I do care about. And so I wrote an essay called More Than One Lens, and it asks essentially it asks like, why is PBS so white, right? And how did it become so dependent on the documentary filmmaker, Ken Burns, whom it has supported over his 40-year career, and, sort of asking larger questions about accessibility for other filmmakers, funding, resources, things like that. So I wrote this essay, and it's only 500 words. I can put a link up later, or maybe somebody else can. When Current, which is the publication that covers public media, reprinted it, kind of, sort of became a thing. And I didn't really think much of it, but journalists started asking the president of PBS, Paula Kerger, what she thought about it. And in several pieces, she said that she respectfully disagreed with what I wrote. And the response was not satisfactory to me, because actually it was like, why do you disagree? Where does the disagreements lie? Where do the disagreements lie? And eventually, a bunch of colleagues from, including Sabrina, we can sort of join in the story. We decided that we wanted to ask publicly, why do you disagree with this argument about diversity at PBS? And so that eventually became a public letter that Beyond Inclusion, this collective of BIPOC-led documentary filmmakers, created. And then, we can go into a little bit more detail, maybe Sabrina can share, but eventually, many different things have happened, a lot of different conversations, and we're still asking for the initial data that we asked for. And just in the last few months, I was approached by some folks to see, would you like to make a podcast? Because this story is kind of unfolding as time passes. And it's an interesting opportunity for me because, it's a new way of storytelling. I've never made a podcast before. It sort of builds on sort of my documentary filmmaking skills, but also it's a reported series. So working with a team of journalists and sound designers and podcasters to create something new. And it's been a really interesting experience. It's called Viewers Like Us. And I can play a short excerpt if we can do that right now. Okay, great.
Mark Twain is supposed to have said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. These stories, when we lift up and we finish, are just always rhyming in the present.
That's documentary filmmaker Ken Burns talking to the New York Times. You may have heard of him. He's a brand, and he sells American history.
Ken Burns and his brilliant team at Florentine Films has taken on one of the pillars of American culture.
Ken Burns captures an intimate story of victory, defeat, and determination.
For 10 years, Ken Burns and Lynn Novick have been working to tell the story.
Whenever his films premiere, they're treated like special events, and his name pops up all over, like on billboards and murals, even on TV game shows.
All right, here's Ken Burns with a clue.
Hemingway gave his first son a middle name of Nicanor, after a Spanish star of this arena sport.
What is bullfighting?
Correct.
For many people, even some of you listening, he's synonymous with historical documentaries. And it's understandable. Burns has built a 40-year career making films on subjects from the Brooklyn Bridge to his latest, a 4-part series on Muhammad Ali. The titles of his multi-hour films read like entries in an encyclopedia. The Civil War,
the game of
baseball
has often shown us who we are.
Jazz, country music. All of this adds up to hundreds of hours of programming on a platform that calls itself one of the country's most trusted institutions. PBS, the Public Broadcasting Service. That's where many Americans turn for unbiased news, kids programs, documentaries, and the arts, like Sesame Street, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and Downton Abbey.
My name is Grace Lee. This is Grace Lee.
Hi, my name is Grace Lee. Hi, my name is Grace Lee.
My name is Grace Lee, and I'm an independent filmmaker. That's a clip from one of my early films about my incredibly common Asian American name. My documentaries also explore American history and culture, and many of them have aired on PBS. But that's where any similarity between me and Ken Burns ends.
I love some of the stats that you presented in your original essay, and I was just sort of, obviously the Buffalo line. So I was just wondering if you can give us a kind of a sense of like just how much mindshare Ken has commanded over the last, couple of decades.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've just observed as a viewer and of public television and someone who is interested in historical documentaries, and I said this in the essay, is that for Asian Americans, which took years to get this series greenlit and funded, we got 5 hours to tell 150 years of American history. For the fastest growing demographic in the United States, right? And then somebody like Ernest Hemingway gets 6 hours. One man who we all know who he is, gets 6 hours. And so this kind of discrepancy is something that, I really wanted to dig into in the essay, or at least just sort of bring up. And that's, sort of where the essay sort of, it was just a lot of different things happening, as, I mentioned that the Ford Foundation asked, for a provocation. And in this new era where everybody is questioning all of our institutions, it felt like it was time to question an institution that we also hold dear, that we sort of look up to in our society. So that's where that came out of.
And also, not only is Hemingway one man 6 hours, but Buffalo is 4 hours, and that is 80% of, like you said, the fastest growing demographic in the United States is now 7% of the population, and I think that really touched me as someone also who like helped advocate for the Buffalo emoji. Like I believe in I believe in Buffalo, but that proportion I think is really striking. And Sabrina, so this actually parallels a lot of conversation and community that was already kind of developing kind of behind the scenes for WhatsApp group. And I was kind of curious how your experience dovetailed with the essay.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, we can absolutely talk about that. I mean, like Grace, I've done, my documentary work, much of it is, and much of my career, frankly, has been fueled by public television. I've done most of my work appears on public television. So it was a very meaningful sort of conversation for me personally and professionally. And I think in terms of the president's response to Grace's essay, I think the reason why the letter that came out of that was so well received and so supported was I think people were really in an industry where we're not really shocked by much. I don't think we're kind of shocked by there's a kind of like a tone deafness, I would say, especially when you consider the moment that we are in, and we were in at that time, to Grace's critique. And rather than take that as an opportunity to really sort of like lean in and figure out ways to achieve the equity and all of the mandates that PBS has around diversity and so on, it just felt like a very somewhat, even if not intentionally, like a somewhat hostile and a little bit of a tone deaf response. And so I think a statement that was maybe meant to quash the conversation actually opened it up. And I think that speaks a lot to like why the letter was so well received and signed by so many people in the industry.
Yeah, no, but originally, I mean, this wasn't the first kind of conversation that a lot of filmmakers of color had. So I know that there was some debate around, a documentary about Tiger Woods, and so it was sort of kind of like ripe for something. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, that
absolutely.
conversation.
Yeah, no, I'll talk about that conversation, but I think you make a good point, and I thank you for reminding me that like the conversation that we're having is beyond inclusion, and I'll tell you a little bit about the origin story behind that. Is not a new conversation, and this is a conversation that has been happening for some time. And I co-chair, for example, the Black Documentary Collective. Grace is the founder, co-founder of ADOC. There's Brown Girls Doc Mafia, and on and on and on. And we've been having these conversations for years. And it's almost as if like they're almost cyclical at a certain point, that every 10 to 15 to 20 years, these conversations come up over and over again. And so we'll get a little bit more into that, but to speak specifically around beyond inclusion, I think what makes our conversation a little bit different, part of it has to do with the timing in which it's come up, in this sort of pandemic, and sort of like racial reckoning sort of period in our history, and we are sort of uniting across, you know, identities, across experience to really, you know, take the industry in general, not just public television, not just like the commercial world, but overall to really talk about ecosystem-wide change. And so getting to your the example about Tiger Woods, the way Beyond Inclusion came about was really just a group of friends and colleagues who really wanted to support Geeta Gambhir when she basically asked, in response to a post on Facebook that Matt Heineman had made about his upcoming documentary about Tiger Woods, she asked why did they not consider, it's two white co-directors who are making this film about this athlete who is Black and Asian, and asked, did you consider, or why didn't you consider having a Black and or Asian co-director to sort of start a conversation around authorship and representation? And it got huge response, and we basically just rallied around Geeta, and then we just kept talking and we kept having these conversations. And then that sort of dovetailed with Grace's essay that came out, and so we sort of formalized our sort of informal conversation so that we can really work together to you know, move this conversation forward and really advocate for us as a community instead of working in silos, and really try to push the conversation beyond the sort of like, again, we keep having this conversation every 10 years, but to kind of just really insist. And I think the data demand, I think, is something maybe that distinguishes it a little bit. Not to suggest that no one else has ever asked for that, but I think, you know, sort of having the will to sort of stick with it and just keep demanding that, and really framing the importance of data is, you know, I think a contribution that we kind of sort of brought to this latest iteration of a conversation around equity, diverse voices, and authorship.
And then in terms of the role that data can play in looking at culture, Richard, you've done a lot of work in publishing, and which is, you know, sort of adjacent to documentary filmmaking. But in terms of what have you found in terms of how data can move the conversation forward and the importance of that data?
First, I want to say, Grace, I really loved your piece, and this project I think is really important. And I think I'm here because I've looked at an adjacent industry, as Jenny mentioned, and I want to just very briefly put up a few slides, or really just like images that help kind of tell a story. And I kind of want to help extrapolate what you all might be able to learn from what I learned in a different context, because it's pretty striking and speaks to the efficacy of data in convincing people. So there are really just two main graphs. So the first one, the first lesson I've learned, which I've been thinking about as possibly useful to you all when thinking about Ken Burns' sort of like endurance. He's never like, you know, he's been here forever. This graph basically shows the top graph is the percentage of white authors published at Random House over the last 70 years. The bottom line is the percentage of Black authors published at Random House. So Random House is kind of like PBS, an institution of cultural production. And what I find interesting about this is Toni Morrison, very famous, obviously a famous author, was also an editor at Random House for about 15 years. And what's interesting is when she was an editor at Random House, she was the first and only Black editor at Random House. You see the spike. There's more Black authors being published. But what's really crazy to me about this graph is as soon as she leaves, they just stop publishing Black writers. And in the social sciences, we call this effect stickiness, where basically racial inequality in culture is just extremely sticky, meaning that there will be, as Sabrina mentioned, cycles of pushes for diversity, more Black editors, more Black authors, more writers of color. But it's as soon as it can really be as ephemeral as the tenure of a Black editor at a publishing house. Again, this should really show you how sticky and intractable whiteness is, that even with good faith efforts to say hire a Black editor, that will do something. But what I think the real lesson though is that that effect can be extremely ephemeral if the structural change isn't really permanent. And for this, for you guys, I was thinking about how there are probably a number of person of color editors, writers coming and going from PBS, but the one constant is Ken Burns. And that to me speaks to a similar effect at Random House, where there's so much inertia over a kind of default white perspective that's being brought to bear in the culture industry. That is going to be really hard to shake. It's relatively easier to hire one Black editor, but as soon as that person leaves, the regression to the mean is often extremely intense. I think that's something that you also, even if you are successful in changing things at PBS, the possibility of a regression to a mean is extremely likely as soon as attention fades away. The second thing I want to talk about, and this also came up in Grace, one of the things you wrote where PBS's response was like, we have Henry Gates, like Skip Gates, he's, this is always the response. And what I want to show you is an interesting structural thing where on the left is basically the attention. So person of color authors are actually more likely to win major literary book prizes from 2011 to 2020. So in terms of the public imagination, the kind of distilled view of what people are reading and things like that, there's a lot of representation of minority writers. The problem is the other graph, which is, this is what it's like on the ground, that about 10% of what the big five publishers publish is by minority writers. The remaining 90% is white authors. So there's always this response. And when I did this piece with the New York Times, we actually looked for a comment from Random House, and very similar to Grace, your experience, where we presented these numbers, they said, well, there's no problem because, we publish like Colson Whitehead, and we try to point out that this is like a tiny part of what you publish. It commands a lot of public attention because he wins book prizes, right? In the way that Skip Gates is a very prominent Black intellectual, right? You have to look at the broader context. And Grace, I think you put it well in your piece that this is more than just one or two Black, or minority figures being elevated. You have to think about the broad distribution of opportunities across the board, because a figure on the right is the reality, what's really happening. And that's, the limited opportunities for non-prestigious, non-hyper-famous minority authors. Although the thing on the left kind of explains why people get confused, right? Because they're like, oh, like Colson Whitehead's doing so well, everything must be okay when things are not okay. And I'm sure that there's similar kinds of data you can get on PBS that I think would resonate with this finding. The last thing I want to say, and then this will be it, is we're talking about data, and I'll say a quick anecdote that a colleague told me is you really need to get data, because if you don't have data, no one's going to believe you. And I was talking to a colleague who's a Black author, and she says, throughout the 80s and 90s, she was constantly saying this, that the industry is really not overwhelmingly white, and just no one would believe her because they just thought that she's exaggerating, she's biased in some way, etc. It's really hard to make the case because the inertia always believe that things are better than they are, when in fact they are usually much worse than they appear. And the last thing I would say too is, because Sabrina and Grace, you mentioned getting data from PBS. I would strongly say don't trust and verify, because early on in the process when studying Random House, we requested data from Random House. They gave us stuff, it was garbage. It was so false, it was so patently incorrect, limited, false. It's not because they were trying to lie to us. At the time, I was just like a random, academic, but they just often are not very good at their own bookkeeping. They're often, to be frank, often incompetent. It's just not something they really care about. They put a lot of thought into, and yeah, there's not a lot of motivation for them to do a professional job doing self-audits. So in the Q&A, and we can talk more about strategies to crowdsource, et cetera, but I would say I would not trust anything PBS gives you, and to find other ways to potentially verify the accuracy of their material.
I think what's great about the conversation about using data in the conversation is because data, there's a way in which data says different things depending on how you present it and what that means. But at least if you get something, even if it's not adequate, it gives you a starting point to speak. So for example, we've asked for very specific kinds of data. We received some data back that front facing, or like at first glance, it's like, oh, look, there's over 40% of films made by, shown by, broadcast by this particular strand or made by people of color. but that doesn't tell the whole story. Let's look at those strands. For example, I had a film, and I'll just be very transparent about that I had a film that was Emmy nominated, that got an Emmy for PBS. It's a film about Sonia Sanchez. At the time that it was licensed by public television, the strand that could license it had a cap of just $6,000 for a license of a film that took 5 years to make, you know? So that means something, that if we're talking about like all these strands are featuring filmmakers of color, what are their budgets? What does that look like? That still says something about the support or the lack of support that filmmakers of color are getting. I mean, certainly I don't think $6,000 is what like Ken Burns is working with. You know what I'm saying? It's like really, so it's good. It's good to like get the data and keep questioning it and using it as sort of like a starting point to like, no, we need this, not this. What about this? Or what about, you know, it gives some context so that when you get the sort of first like pass, I suppose, of data that is sort of self, you know, makes you look good, you have to dig a little bit deeper, but at least that conversation can keep getting propelled using that framework.
I mean, one of the things that we just had a new episode of Viewers Like Us come out today, and there was a meeting with PBS leaders and Beyond Inclusion, and the data that Sabrina is talking about, you know, they presented something to us while also presenting it to the press, and we can drop a link, you know, into the chat. But, you know, that's the data that, you know, sort of says it's not what we asked for, but they're numbers. So here they are, you know, and data can be interpreted in many different ways. And that's one of the reasons why we ask for very specific numbers, because once we have that baseline, we can really assess, you know, it's not just taking our word for it that you're doing a good job or a bad job, but here's where we are. And then where can we go from here? And how do we actually measure the goals that we want to achieve? It's pretty simple.
Yeah, these are great points. And yeah, Sabrina, specifically what you were saying, I just want to follow up. I think it's a great point what you're saying. And yeah, what's the good thing about data, it's a starting place. You can keep on recursively, incrementally building on it. And just the one quick thing I want to say too is, as we learn more about things via the information we were getting, we discovered that, yeah, inequality, as you say, like happens in many different directions in different ways. And something that can look good can disguise another form of inequality. So something that we've been looking into more is book advances for authors. So, you know, something that can look like equal, they're like, oh, you know, the number of minority authors getting book advances going up, but then you look at the amounts, right? And that's, I think, Sabrina, something that you're talking about as well, right? That like once you dig in, you can find other layers of inequality that can be really as profound as the headcount issue. And I just want to say that's really important, because I find institutions, when you put pressure on them, I found historically that they always want the quickest solution to make people happy, to just sort of put a Band-Aid over it. And that often can mean more superficial solutions to the inequality problem that can mask sort of deeper inequality issues.
Richard, when Random House gave you not great data or very sloppy data, what was the methodology that you then, you know, created in order to get your own kind of, I guess, clean data? And how did you think? And how did you think about it? Like, how did, you know, what is the process of doing that?
Yeah, I hope this might be useful to you guys, because I think it is important to get the best data you can from PBS, but find ways to triangulate from relatively more neutral sources. So I don't know what this would be the equivalent for something like PBS, but we just looked at library holdings. So there's a website called WorldCat, which documents every book held in a library across the world. And we found it was a better way to figure out what they published, because the list that they gave us for the books that they published for the past 70 years was obviously incomplete. But by looking at this other repository, just like what's in libraries, it just was a hack to get a better list. And it takes some time. Yeah, we had to really brainstorm with my colleagues, but I think there's always ways to find that hack, to find another way to get at the information that you're looking at that doesn't rely on the institution itself. I don't know what that would be, but yeah, I would encourage you to explore it. So there are methods in social sciences that we use, where we use research teams to collect information on authors. I won't really get into the weeds, but it's pretty rigorous. We have multiple people researching the racial and gender identities of individuals. if we can't confirm it through public resources, and usually it requires some kind of public declaration of their identity, they go untagged. So, so yeah, that's also tricky. And the New York Times, they also have procedures that I use for the New York Times version where, but yeah, it's really sensitive. So people have developed really rigorous methods to identify people by race and gender that I'd be happy to talk about at a later point. I don't want to get into the weeds, but there are
yeah. But basically you self-did it, yeah.
As we were waiting for, we wrote the letter in March, right? And as we were waiting for the requests, we weren't holding our breath, but we're all documentary filmmakers. We know how to do research. We know how to tell a story. We know how to track things down. And several of our members, Maria Aggie Carter actually is sort of spearheaded this. She went and tracked down, looked at the top corporate leadership at the top 3 public television stations, WNET, WETA, and WGBH, and create Sabrina, because she's multi-talented, created this flyer, and then we put it out, and I'm just going to drop a link to that in the chat. We put it on Twitter, and so you can sort of look at these pictures of the people. We had everyone in our group fact check it, right? And so we've asked, has anyone seen this flyer? What do you think about it? Nothing. So, there's a way that, as we're waiting for this, even though we're not data experts, we can track these elements down ourselves.
So in terms of what specifically, I took a look at the PBS flyer or presentation you presented, which is a lot of like this many, this percentage of shows, feature hosts of color, or I think talent of color, which I think is a sort of a very, a general description. In terms of the data that you think is actually useful, what do you actually want from PBS and the member stations that would actually kind of give them a less sort of like brochure version of what's happening on the ground?
Well, one thing I was just thinking of when talking about the licensing, for example, is that we're talking about, I just want to emphasize again, we're talking about ecosystem-wide change. We're not talking about starting another program or something like that. We're really talking across the board. So it really means a deep dive into what we ask. But I think even like beyond some of what we ask, like one of the things that I think I've learned over the course of like the work that we've been doing is that there are, again, I use the example of like this one strand that I think probably features the most filmmakers of color, but it is like the most severely underfunded among, all the strands. That's a problem. Another thing that you might not realize, speaking about the PBS ecosystem, for example, is that the exorbitant fees, for example, that like a local station has to pay, for example, to be part of the PBS system. What are the implications for that in terms of the funding for production, in terms of the programming, right? Another thing that came to mind, I just lost my train of thought. There was like one other thing that I wanted to mention. It'll come back to me. But the point that I'm making, the larger point that I'm making is that it's not just about counting the number of people who was on this season of this series or that series. It's really doing a deep, I remember the other thing I wanted to say. We've had some conversations with folks from local stations, and even the way I guess like the administrative or operational like process for them to even access the work that we produce is really difficult for them to identify and to find in order to program it. And when you consider that public television's mandate is about amplifying diverse voices, and even the way they distribute that information is inaccessible or opaque for the very people who are going to program it, that's a problem. Their operation doesn't reflect their mandate. So again, I just wanted to emphasize that it's really about more than just one set of numbers. It's really a deep dive into every aspect of the process of the chain or what have you.
Somebody put it in the chat, how many hours of PBS nonfiction television have been directed or produced by BIPOC filmmakers versus by white filmmakers over the past 10 years of all spending on PBS nonfiction television over the past 10 years? What percentage has been directed or produced by BIPOC filmmakers? And this also, we're asking about the top 25 production companies that have produced the most content for PBS over the past 10 years. How many of them are BIPOC-led versus white-led? It sort of dovetails with what Richard was talking about. You don't just, who's in leadership positions in these companies, who's the director, who's the storyteller. And one of the main things why we need data is we want to see the proportional access to it, because it sort of tells a more thorough story. But yeah, we also, if you can read it in the chat, but if people are watching this later, you probably can't see it. It's all on our website, bipocmakers.com, for Beyond Inclusion. And you can sort of also, see all of the arguments and who signed the letter, which includes not just filmmakers, but executives and people working within the public television system.
Someone else dropped in the chat a point that I think dovetails with what Richard said, which is actually ITVS actually had their diversity data, and as opposed to, there's another group that did an audit of diversity in public TV in 2016, and it's incredibly laborious to do something like that. So it's impressive that ITVS actually had its diversity numbers, but in many cases, I feel that point that Richard made, it's not usually that they're like trying to hide it. They literally just don't have it because they have not cared about it enough to measure it, which is why it does not exist. And so I guess one question would be, for everyone, like, given what you guys asked for, are there public sources that can be used, either voluntary or just publicly available ways to recreate your own set of data as best as you can? Because what sometimes happens is, like, when you actually have your version of data out there and they don't quite find it right, they get super motivated then to like basically like cough up more detailed data in response.
One thing I just want to say is, like, this is not our job, right? Like, we're filmmakers. We want to make films about, all of American stories. Like, we're not data analysts. I mean, this is the job. I mean, ITVS, it's great that it's laborious, but that is the job of these institutions, to understand, where they stand. I think it's not that hard also to hire an independent person. There's lots of studies that have been done by Annenberg Center or UCLA, Ralph Bunche Center, about diversity and ethnicity in Hollywood. The Stacy Smith study on women in media that is always cited everywhere. And I don't think it's that hard to get an independent researcher to figure this stuff out, right? We are here to hold, this institution accountable and ask for this stuff. And then, it's an exercise to go find, the top leadership at these 3 stations, but this is not how we want to spend the rest of our time. There are people within our group who like this kind of stuff, but, personally, like, that's not my idea of fun, even though it has to be done.
Yeah, and I think too that also speaks again to the will to want to do this work. I mean, it gets very frustrating to hear, like, again, these cyclical conversations about we have to do better, how shall we do better, the mea culpas and so on. And then it's sort of like the same thing that keeps repeating. One of the things that I find like really frustrating, for example, is just over the course of like the work that, we've been doing, is often that the solutions are just replicated. It's like the same thing. And there tends to be a focus, for example, on creating like a program to support emerging filmmakers. Now that is, every industry needs to cultivate talent. So that is not the issue, but it's almost a little bit of like an off-ramp, because that doesn't address the provocation that Grace made in the first place. What Grace was talking about has nothing to do with a lack of trained BIPOC filmmakers. You know what I'm saying? So that is the kind of thing that, while it's not our job to do that the labor that Grace is talking about, but like, they have to demonstrate that they are serious about, again, systemic change, not a one-off program. Because Grace and I have been, have benefited from and have been part of like the PBS training pipeline, and they've been like really actually great programs. But the fact that these sort of barriers to entry and access and support across the board, whether we're talking about production or marketing, whatever, persists, is a problem. So they have the work that has to be done has to reflect a new sort of approach and understand and appreciation of the issue of what we're talking about. That again, it's not like one thing here, one thing there, and we're done. It's really systemic. It's why does like your process not reflect the priorities, for example? Why is it like we're talking about public television for example, and we're talking about someone that takes up a lot of space. And what are the implications for that? Because I think someone had pointed out, like, now that there's been a Muhammad Ali series by Ken Burns, who's going to get to do that? Who's going to get to tell that story? There was an opportunity for that to be co-directed with a Black filmmaker who really wants to tell Muhammad Ali's story. That has passed, and it was something that was shared with Ken Burns and his family, essentially, were the authors of that. So what are the implications for that? So, like, what we need to see is something that reflects a real deep dive and systemic approach to what we're talking about, and not just like, here's several $1 million over whatever for this program or that program. It has to be a little bit more than that.
I just want to mention that, Grace, I think something you said really resonated with me when I was listening to you guys. I was like, yeah, this shouldn't really be your job, that you guys should be doing other things that you're really good at. And it makes me sad, actually, because I'm like, this is awesome you guys are doing. But the funny thing is, this is actually my job as an academic. And I have, one thing I was thinking, like, we can easily download all these PBS transcripts or actual the videos, and we can use machine learning algorithms to tell you, what proportion of time is Ken Burns controlled, right? Like the sort of like white male voice, like that's something that you should not figure out how to do, but like this is something that I do professionally, as part of like what I do. And there's a bunch of people like me. And I actually am working with Mellon on a new thing with the 90-Second Why, a very similar kind of project, right? On all of their books, book lecture series, right? Who gets to talk at these things and like the crowd Q&A. Like I find that there's a lot of money with like Mellon, that academics have access to. This is an interesting problem for academics, people like me. You mentioned the USC study, which is great. You should be partnering, like, I think the value of your perspective is that you're really the canary in the coal mine, right? That what disturbed me about the publishing thing is it was actually writers that were cueing me to this problem. Academics we're distant from this stuff. Right. So we were like, yeah, everything was solved in the 80s and 90s, like multiculturalism. But then all these writers I was talking to, like, this is a fucked up situation. And that's where I got a sense of the problem. So you have a real sensitivity and foresight where the problems are. And I really admire all the stuff you're doing, but yeah, you should not be filling out like Excel spreadsheets. That's ridiculous, So we kind of need your insights and your on the ground intuitions that we can then study at scale using various data methods and so forth. And there's a lot of money to support this too. This is a target area of research like Mellon, ACLS, et cetera. So I just would say, like, amazing work you're doing. You should find people to collaborate with so you don't have to spend more time doing this. And there's a lot of, I think, room for collaboration.
Yeah, I mean, I would encourage any people like you, Richard, I'm going to DM you after this, to like support us. And also, I know there's a room full of like investigative journalists. I mean, this is also your job to ask this question. It's public service journalism about public institutions. It's one of the things I find very interesting and exhilarating about working on this podcast is at least there's like a creative sort of a creative outlet in trying to tell this story in a different way rather than just in print. I mean, yes, it's much more fun to do something like this during a pandemic than go out with a crew and a camera and all of that stuff. But it's been an interesting process, just like talking to various people throughout, who have been affected by the system. Sabrina and I, like, we are like PBS stalwarts. Like, we went to that Producers Academy. We have a lot invested in this system. We've invested a lot of our own labor and our own goodwill, to have, these projects that we want to have accessible by everybody for free, not through a streaming service or like governed by an algorithm. And so, I think that it was interesting to have that meeting with PBS. It was sort of kind of dubbed a listening tour, but at the same time, we keep talking and the same questions keep coming up and the same solutions, throw money here, throw money to this program. It's not enough to address the systemic issues.
You made an important point, Grace, about these are documents. I mean, PBS is supposed to serve the public and it's available for free. I think, there's a certain kind of class of folks who say, there are a lot of documentaries being created, on Netflix or Hulu or, Amazon originals or being obtained. But I was talking to some professors, and one of the hardest things they have is they cannot get educational streaming rights for those, for some of the documentaries, like the 13th that ran on Netflix, in part because those companies just don't want to have those conversations, right? Whereas the the documentaries that we all make, their educational rights is like a very, very key part. And the fact that, there's a lot of stuff happening inside sort of, proprietary walls actually in some ways is qualitatively different in terms of how accessible it is. So Serena, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was gonna actually bring that up too, because I feel like we're talking a lot about public television, so it might almost feel like we were picking on PBS, but this is, again, ecosystem wide. So when we're talking about, you're talking about like streamers, for example, and there's been a lot of talk about like this is the golden age of documentary, and because there's Netflix and the Hulus of the world that are making these films. But I can tell you that I did a survey of members of the Black Documentary Collective, and it just so happens that almost like the majority of our membership are established filmmakers. There are not as many emerging, because these are the organization was started like 20 years ago, so we were all like sort of beginners then, and the folks that have stuck with the organization are now established filmmakers. So these are people who have won Emmys, nominated for Emmys, or Academy members. Grace and I are Academy members. So these are established people, and one of the things that they talk about is the lack of accessibility, or how opaque it is to get at any traction or connection with streamers, because even there are certain production companies, production service companies that are sort of like greenlit to be the shepherds of these projects, and they are not connected to those companies. So what are the implications for there too? So again, there's this golden age, but for the most part, our members are not benefiting, are not participating in that golden age. And we have to think about, there's one thing to talk about like getting a seat at the table and access and equity and so on, but we are also talking about what we need to create our own golden age, because we're not part of that in a meaningful way. It's not golden for everyone.
Both you and Grace are part of the Academy, and the documentary branch of the Academy is really interesting for many reasons. And I know you guys both joined in recent years, and I was like curious what you've seen in terms of the talent that is represented in the documentary branch. I know Grace, what year did you join? Were you invited to join?
I think 2017. Just for me, just kind of first glance, the documentary branch is the most diverse branch in the entire Academy. I think that's true, and also probably a couple of years ago reached gender parity in terms of its members, and working really hard to actually be more inclusive in terms of international. The whole Academy needs much more international representation if you're purporting to represent all of filmmaking in the world. But yeah, I think it's with leaders. Right now, two of the governors are Roger Ross Williams, Jean Chen, and Roy Kennedy. I think this is a priority for this branch.
I was invited in 2018, so I guess a year after Grace, and I think that's right, that it's not till 2020 that there's at least gender parity. So that really says something, that even with like an initiative or a push to diversify the Academy, that we have a ways to go still.
One of the most interesting things about the Academy, because after the Oscars so white push, a lot of my friends kind of got invited, and a lot of them specifically in documentary film. And one byproduct I thought that was interesting was, at least in 2019, of the 5 films that were nominated for the best documentary, not a single one of them actually was helmed by a white male director, which I thought was sort of reflective of what was going on in the doc branch. And I think even in 2020, maybe only one, and he was like co-directing, which is American Factory, I believe. And if what does that reflect? If you look at that, right, clearly the nominations sort of indicate the talent pool is there from at least from a theatrical documentary, which is slightly different but adjacent to what is PBS is doing. Why do you, when you see what's happening sort of and being recognized in the Academy versus what we're still seeing with Ken Burns and PBS?
That like 2019 slate, for example, of nominees again is a reminder that like we have to look deeper, because the reason why the industry looks the way it does is because there's a lack of talent, and there's a lack of filmmakers that are here and ready and know how to do what they do. So like, let's stop with the, okay, we'll just create this program and mentor you and teach you and look a little bit, ask harder questions and make harder choices, you know, that really push the industry toward a more equitable place.
Richard, after you published your studies, did that move the needle or move the conversation in any way that you found meaningful?
I'm not sure. I after my response, I kind of want to ask Grace and Sabrina what they would imagine like a really productive response to this push. But I'll give you my my experience. The response, the after effects were really odd to me because a lot of my friends who publish trade books say that it had instant reverberations and that they were all writers were asked to do the self-declaration, like self-auditing and so forth. Friends of mine who are editors at publishing houses were saying that things were changing. And I ended up doing some collaborations with PEN America on a study, something with the Nation. So there were things, but they were all kind of para-publishing, like kind of para to the institution I was trying to communicate with. But I was surprised that there was zero communication with the publishers or editors. It was really weird to me because I know their data is really bad and I have really good data. And I offered, it was sort of this open thing. And also my co-author and my editor at the New York Times, no one got in touch with him. And when we did try to communicate with them, they were really standoffish and really unhelpful. So it's been a weird experience. And I assume the outcome will be different for you guys because you have a more working relationship with PBS, which I think is cool. So I kind of want to hear more about what you hope to be the outcome. And it's possible because Gus, my co-writer, he's at the Times, so he's not really in publishing and I'm not in publishing, but I was surprised by a strong interest in the kind of, again, para-institutional formations of publishing, but like complete zero back and forth with publishers themselves. I don't know why, but I know there's been effects, basically what I've been hearing from the inside, that things are changing, but they had zero interest in actually communicating with me.
Well, I can just say that I've asked for interviews with leaders at PBS for this podcast, and I've been refused. I mean, I can't, that's not entirely true. I've talked to different people in, different aspects, but at PBS leadership itself, the very people who we're asking of this data, Paula Kerger and Sylvia Bug, who is the chief executive programmer. I guess they listened to the first episode of the podcast, which you heard a snippet of, and said they weren't going to go forward with an interview. So that answers your question there, but we'll keep trying. I mean, I still think the door is completely open to have a conversation because, again, we're not trying to burn it down. We are trying to make it better, right? Like this is an institution that with a mission that we believe in. And, I think those of us who have lived throughout, have been affected by this institution and have a lot of care for it. We are doing this because we care about it.
Yeah.
Can I ask you guys, just to reiterate the earlier question I was hoping to pose? I guess, yeah, I mean, what would then, then if it's so hard to just have a dialogue or, any kind of conversation, I guess what would for you be what would be a satisfactory outcome for this advocacy, this push? What would be, yeah, like something that would feel like change to you?
Well, I think again, there's data that we asked for, and obviously the end game for that data is to use that data to be responsive to it. And again, some of the things that I alluded to earlier, again, like, so for example, when we're talking about the local stations who don't even know how to find our work, I mean, that's a very concrete thing that just should not be. And it certainly is inconsistent with the mandate of public television. Like, how can you possibly uphold that mandate if your local stations can't even, like, the way the work comes down the pipeline makes it really opaque and difficult to even identify work from different, from filmmakers and even to even program it. Or again, we're talking about diversity of voices and one voice is upheld as like the storyteller, the only, you know, and talking about like all the work that that person has coming down the pipeline, for example, which means more space that's going to be taken up. That doesn't seem, again, consistent with what the mandate is. Talking about strands where featuring filmmakers of color. Why are they the most underfunded? I mean, that is a very concrete change that can happen. And outside of the public television sector, for example, we're talking about streamers. If there's certain reasons why they operate the way that they do, but if you have like a set number of, if you have certain sort of greenlit production companies, let's say, just use that as an example, what is the leadership of that? What does that mean in terms of the talent that you get access to if it's led by the same people? What are you doing proactively to diversify those greenlit companies so that you can get a diversity of talent and access and stories? So there are concrete things that can be done, even if you don't want to talk to us. There's things that you know that are measurable, and any number of those things could be a starting point for something that reflects that this is going to be about a systemic difference, not sort of like a one-off program that in 10, 15 later, the emerging filmmakers today are going to be asking the same questions in 20 years that we're asking now. And it's good business for PBS. I mean, they've invested in us. So we shouldn't be having this conversation. I mean, Grace, you mentioned that you had an interview with someone at PBS, I believe, who among the filmmakers that they've met, none of them came out of the system that PBS trained us in, right?
Yeah, I mean, I talked to this for the podcast coming down the line. I talked to a veteran journalist and filmmaker who was one of the original producer directors of Eyes on the Prize, you know, and just, you know, that was a very different time, but also, you know, the struggles of Henry Hampton to get that series on, you know, made, you know, had to mortgage his house, all of this stuff. I mean, these struggles are continuing over generations. And something she said was, yeah, and, you know, she works at WGBH and she talked about how, you know, there was this producers academy, you know, but I don't know one person who's come out of that academy. And I'm like, well, I did, right? It's like, and and so did Sabrina. And it was a great opportunity to sort of understand how the system works. You know, it was a great program. I met a lot of great people. I think Jeff Seelbach is in this room and he was there. I met him there. You know, it was a great thing, and they stopped it. They stopped the program. And this is for people who are not emerging filmmakers. This was for people who are, you know, kind of had a little bit of experience and, you know, to build the path to continue, you know, building a career in public television and making pieces for public television. There's a lot of things that I guess the system has tried, and you know, but constantly getting scared about like being called out rather than kind of embracing like, here are the people who know what they're talking about, you know, is something that I just find puzzling.
Do you find that the political structure or the of PBS and how it's organized may create some of the barriers for them for them to like move institutionally forward?
The way that they're organized, is that what you said?
Yeah, you know, the Corporation of Public Broadcast, like in terms of just the member stations are very powerful, right? There's a lot going on in what we kind of use for the umbrella term of PBS. I feel like there's a lot going on that actually may be at tension, you know, with itself or, you know, into the with the larger ecosystem. One
thing that just comes to mind when you say that is like when we think like you watch like a PBS pledge drive or something, and then you give your $5, your $10, your $20, like there's probably certain assumptions people make about what they are supporting. I was very surprised to learn, for example, and I mentioned it earlier, the exorbitant, what seemed to me really exorbitant fees for a member station to be a member. Like if that is the lift that they have to do just to be a participant, again, what are the implications for programming and everything that we're talking about? Maybe that's something that needs to be looked at. Would people give money if they thought that that's what they were giving their money toward? You know, we have the posters with the leadership at the top, the top three stations that produce most of the public television content. What are we funding, you know, with that, you know? So those are things that come to my mind as concrete things to look at and think about. Maybe that needs to get changed up a little bit.
I think one of the difficulties also is it's a really convoluted system. I mean, even me, who's had films on PBS for over 10 years, I don't understand it. Working on this podcast is sort of helping me understand how it is like this confederated system of 330 systems that also have to pay dues. You know, there's this corporation for public broadcasting that, you know, is the way that, you know, some stations or programs might get funded, but that's a completely different entity, you know. So just kind of wrapping your head around it, it's often used as an excuse to like, well, this is very complicated, you know. But actually PBS did a great job of pivoting during the pandemic. You know, suddenly everyone's doing remote learning and they're very proud of that, right? If you can, if you have the will to make these changes, it's not that hard. Right. It actually is an incredible opportunity for them to take the lead and say, well, we've always believed in this. This is our mission, and we can actually, you know, follow it with our actions.
We're going to open up for questions. There have been some interesting ones in the chat. One of which was, have you heard anything from Ken Burns and any reactions since your original essay and then all the subsequent reactions?
I mean, not directly. I've requested interviews, but he's not, he's refusing. However, he has spoken in public numerous times saying that he believes in the objectives of the Beyond Inclusion letter and that we could all do better. And I guess my question for him is like, what is that specifically? You know, doing better is always a response that everybody says, you know, when it comes to these issues. But again, like these diversity metrics, like what does that actually mean? Like, what is the goal? You know, is it to give more space to BIPOC filmmakers? Is it to hire, you know, a BIPOC co-director on some of these projects that are coming up? I mean, I would encourage Ken Burns to provide some of this data that we're asking for, because he can, you know, that could be a really interesting, you know, if he did that, the whole system would follow, because, you know, the system seems to sort of do whatever Ken Burns wants.
I'm doing some stuff with a colleague at Netflix, and what I find at Netflix is they have an intense desire to self-understand their own programming. And I mean, partly because they have the money, they have killer data science internal units, but it leads them to make pretty interesting decisions where they have proven that shows focused on diversity and so forth tend to do really well. My question sounds like at PBS, I'm curious if there's not that intense there's not that intense desire to self-understand, like all the questions you're raising is just like, get some data on that, you know, like all these member stations, right? What do they like, you know, like how do these different, I just feel like the data would borne out that actually a lot of programs focused on diversity actually do really well with specific different groups. And, you know, again, I find that at other, you know, kinds of institutions, they have that intense desire to self-understand. And like, if Ken Burns is not super eager to like have this data, share it, like why not? Why isn't there this desire to just understand more and self-understand? You know,
they're not necessarily the most self-reflective institutions, like, you know, but I do feel like just one of my observations, people who come from Silicon Valley loves measuring things, and in fact, if it can't be quantified in numbers, often with lots of zeros, they don't necessarily know how to value it. And in this case, in Netflix case, it turns out maybe it was good in terms of understanding how the diversity of programming impacts. And in the case of social networks and whatnot that want, you know, the numbers to go up and to the right, sometimes the thing that you measure, let's say audience engagement, has sort of like secondary effects that may have been unintentional. And for better or worse, I mean, at least from my perspective, this is one of the cases where that technical engineering perspective on measuring and moving things probably is better than maybe some of the more legacy ways of looking at issues. One question that was also earlier was, did the Producers Academy include training on fundraising? Because is, you know, part of the secret to Ken Burns' sort of larger success, the fact that he can really fundraise. And I think PBS has basically made that argument, right? That in some ways he brings in the money, and in some ways he brings his own independent money.
I'll go first and say, I mean, it covered everything. It was a very comprehensive program, and it even included talking about corporate underwriting, because sometimes you see that on public television. And the assumption I remember at the time is that by virtue of going through this program, we would have access to that in a certain way, but that just has not materialized in that way. And it reminds me of, for example, when you asked about Ken Burns speaking publicly, there was something that, and I can't remember what the article was, but he was talking about why he loves PBS so much, that he can go to PBS. He could have gone many other places. He could go to the streamers, but he can go to PBS and say, I need, 30 million in 10 years to do this series, and he will get it. I don't know anybody else who can say that. And this is, again, in a publicly funded system. So this is what I say, again, when you're talking about concrete things that you can do, it's like, if you have, instead of creating yet another program, or it's okay, again, it's not about not creating programs, but it's about the follow through. If you have like X number of people who went through the Producers Academy that was on for, I don't know, I'm not sure about how many years, let's say it was like a 10-year program, looking at how have they been integrated and have been able to do all of the different things that we learned about in that program. How has that, how many has had corporate underwriting for their work, or were able to access certain resources? Like, that could be a very concrete measure. And if that has, and if it bears out that they have not really been able to leverage any of that, like, as Grace was saying with the interview that she had with the journalist, like doesn't even know who came out of the program, then that seems to be like somewhere where you've definitely fallen short, because what is the point of making that investment if there's no follow through? So that, again, could be a very concrete thing, that if that's not happening, well, what do we do to make that happen so that our investment pays off in a meaningful way? And it's not just like, oh, we did this great thing and we were, virtue signaling like this very good thing that we did, and then it just sort of like dissipates into an unquantified, nothing, So that's what comes to,
Yeah, on the fundraising thing too, Ken Burns often says, well, I do all my fundraising outside of the system, and that's why I'm offering up space for other people to get the fund. Well, we all do our fundraising outside of the system as well. Yes, maybe we get some money through whatever, like acquisitions or public television, but we're also raising money from foundations, individuals, philanthropy, grants, all of that stuff. What we don't have is a guaranteed distribution for every single project we're going to make over a 40-year career on public television. We have to, every single time it's starting over and pitching ourselves and saying, is this worthy, right?
Don't have an institution that's branded us as like the American filmmaker or the American storyteller. And help to build a legacy that makes this possible, so.
Another question from a young filmmaker who is new to the industry. What can a young filmmaker contribute? And then what can you do to make it better? Can they contribute to this conversation? Can they move things forward?
In Jung Kim, I see you. You can join some of these networks that, one of the reasons I started, I co-founded ADOC, Asian American Documentary Network, is it's an incredibly lonely field. And these questions have been coming up for generations. In the latest episode of the podcast, I talk about my mentor, Lonnie Ding, 25 years ago. I didn't realize she was talking about these exact same issues about public television. If you find like-minded people who can sort of, it's the only reason I could do this right now is because of Beyond Inclusion, just the support and camaraderie of people like Sabrina and other people who are here in the chat. It's a lonely endeavor, especially if you're trying to make films and also, call out inequality, right? We're organizers, and that's something that I think I've learned has kind of helped keep me sane in doing all of this kind of work. Yeah, I don't know. I think just finding a community to sort of talk through these issues and educating yourself is really important.
And it's really encouraging that you asked that question about what can I do, because I think what happens too, and what I think sometimes why these cycles keep happening is because, like, this is not our job. And if it's just a few of us doing all this heavy lifting, then it's not really sustainable. So the more of our community of filmmakers that participate and help us with the lift, and it's not just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of us, it can make a big difference. So you join ADOC, you join BDC, and you also actually put in the work and put in the time. It can be a lot more manageable if there are more people doing it, and not just a select few that just cannot sustain that alone.
Have you guys seen any local PBS stations providing a better example in regard to the diversity data, or at least more diverse programming or more diverse staffing?
Grace, you might have a different answer, but I know that from the conversations that I recall is that they are actually say that they want more diverse programming, and it's just again, I just say it's quite shocking that they have challenges to even accessing it themselves within the system. So that's kind of like the observation that I've made. I don't know if you have another insight, Grace.
It's interesting that, again, Sabrina, you've alluded to this before, this kind of consciousness about diversity comes in waves, right? And I think we're in this post George Floyd wave where everybody hired DEI officers in 2020. PBS just hired one in August 2021. And people are slowly realizing that they have to provide some of this information. For example, I know that WGBH, or GBH as they've rebranded, has provided recently like their diversity data of staff and leadership, and it was 80% white and 90%, almost 90% white leadership. So at least they're acknowledging it, but what they're doing, I think we're still sort of waiting to hear how the DEI initiatives will pan out.
Richard, if you were to strategize in like moving the conversation forward with getting data, like what are the pieces that would need to kind of move right now in terms of like funding and academics and working, collaborating with Beyond Inclusion?
Yeah, you need to get money. And the good news is that academic foundations, so NEH, Mellon, I'm working with the 92nd Y, and I was surprised that they're to me a really important cultural institution, but they have, the person I work with there says he has a hard time getting Mellon interested in stuff. But academics find it relatively easy to get stuff from Mellon. So I think you need collaborators. I know this takes more time, like everything takes time, but I think this would actually save you time on the back end, that academics tied to research institutions, there's just a lot of money, especially Jenny and I are working on a project with Emory. It was crazy that we got all this money just like, I think like a few emails.
It was like 3 weeks. I mean, it was like so rapid in terms of,
yeah, like,
I've never seen a university move that fast.
Yeah, so really partnering with academics, ideally located at private research institutions, just finding people you trust and you like to work with is the first step. Again, I feel this sorrow hearing you guys, like this takes away from your work. And, something that we don't talk about too, what's really, I think, terrible is, it's always, again, minority producers who then are burdened with, like, why don't white filmmakers feel this, this, as Sabrina says, this creates an overall bad ecosystem for everybody, not just minority producers. So the double burden on you guys is that, you don't get to make awesome, beautiful films. So I would say it will take time on the front end to find collaborators, but it'll save you time on the back end if you really want to bring this to fruition, and then the next step is, once you have collaborators that can do things, then a lot of that is, working with them, figuring what data you need to prove what kind of point. It really comes down to what do you want to argue, who do you want to persuade, and a lot of that is kind of scholarly type academic stuff. We design experiments, we collect data. This is, again, stuff that you really should not be worrying about because there are people trained to do this. And we just need to know, again, what are you trying to prove? What will move the needle the most for you guys in terms of persuading either the public or the institution itself? You guys have questions. We design research programs to help prove that in a compelling way. But I think the first step is finding people you trust, that you like to work with, who have access to money, lots of money, because this is a really worthy project. It's especially, the diversity thing also, the wave also comes and goes in the academy too. So people about this right now, all the research funding is being poured into this. So it would be very easy to get a lot of money to fund this if you can kind of connect with the right people. And I'd be happy to talk to you guys about this.
And I probably know funders, independent funders. And in terms of the scale of funding for something like this, this tends to be in the hundreds of thousands or like low millions, or if you've seen similar things in the past, Richard, even ballpark, like.
I'll tell you what you can probably get, and I'll tell you what you probably need.
Okay. Yeah.
You don't need much, especially, I think, Sabrina, your interest in this, what you say, the overall ecosystem is compelling to me, but starting with I think you want to start with something specific like PBS. I think this is a great focus. You want to work from small to big. But a PBS study, 40,000, which you could easily get. I can't really get too specific, but I'm starting to do some stuff with Nellen with the 92nd Y, and that's an easy ask. Or an ecosystem type project, easily $100,000 to $200,000. But I have to warn you though that just managing stuff becomes a job, and that's where you want people you can work with. You don't want to be doing this, as you know, you guys do a ton of other things. But yeah, I mean, if you want to, I guess, be the thought leaders of an important research project where there's a lot of other people doing the heavy lifting, but you kind of help steer it to good questions. $100,000, $200,000, that's not hard to get, especially in the current academic climate. But you don't
That's
need
so low compared to like the marketing budget of like a Ken Burns documentary.
Something I've observed over time is that a lot of the program officers of the large major foundations they are actually fairly diverse at this point, like whether or not at Ford or at MacArthur. So it's interesting because I know just dealing with a lot of them from other aspects of life, they are very aware and vote with their dollars. But at the same time, it seems interesting that even their influence on something as large as PBS is slow over time, or at least can't necessarily, you have to find the right leverage point with the right sums of money in the right program. So even if they have the dollars in order to kind of move these institutions, it can still be kind of an uphill challenge. Let me see, okay, no, there's not a question. And in terms of, Richard, if you were to think about why would academics be interested in doing this kind of research, like in terms of their own, not only to kind of shed light on it, but in terms of where they are in their own careers, like what could something like this kind of do in an academic's career?
Oh, what's our self-interest in this kind of work?
Yeah. It's like, what's your self-interest? I'm just trying to understand.
I'll go for most self-interested, least self-interested. Most self-interested is that, again, with the cycles of interest, this is an important problem for academics to think about. It's a novel problem, relatively novel, even though it's an old problem. And there's a lot of thinking about culture and diversity, especially with the affordance of data. It's very interesting and novel, and we can really learn new things. So that's sort of like the intellectual rationale. The less self-interested rationale, and this is really increasingly important for academics, especially humanities people, to really have some impact and do some good in the world. And I think clearly this kind of project, if you do it well, could really do some good. I'm an English professor, and I would love if PBS can make more compelling, stuff that speaks to my experience. If I could be a part of that, I find that extremely compelling. Even if I had a tiny minuscule part of facilitating that, that's extremely compelling to me. So, but yeah, I think academics increasingly with the stuff going on in society, we want to feel like we're actually having some impact and doing some good in the world. So there's a lot of people like me that would love to partner with you guys, because otherwise we're just sort of talking to other academics and doing trivial insular type things, but doing stuff where actually, could have connection to the levers of power with cultural production and the stories we tell, again, extremely compelling.
And then what's the time scale sometimes? If let's say someone is willing to fund it fairly shortly, how long would it take to design and then maybe execute even a reasonable size or a small study? We're talking 2 years, we're talking a year, we're talking 6 months.
Yeah, it depends how much of this you want this to consume your life, and this goes for someone like my side. But I don't know, you could easily get 50 to 200 for 2 years, a study. And I think honestly for PBS, that would be more than enough to do it, to produce something really powerful that you get out into the media, convince people, persuade people. I would not personally, and I would recommend you guys not sign up for anything with an academic for more than 2 years. I think 1 year, 6 months, every 6 months you reevaluate, is this actually accomplishing anything? But I find recently with foundations, things are moving faster. Foundations want to fund stuff that actually has impact, that I think is good for you guys. That things could happen in the 1 month to 2 month thing. If you have a really compelling pitch and it's really tight, they would give you a starter grant and be like, okay, let's give you 50K, let's see where this goes. And I think foundations want to move faster they know the social problems in front of us are fast moving. So A lot of it is just like how fast do you guys want to move, how much of your own life and time do you want to put into this kind of thing though, which takes you away from other things. So yeah.
Any last thoughts from the panelists? We're 2 minutes left, or I feel like maybe you guys will like DM each other afterwards.
Absolutely. Richard, you're going to hear from us for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh yeah, no, you should really offload this to other people. I really admire what you guys are doing, but you should be doing other things too.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of, I mean, I've said it, sorry to keep promoting the podcast, but I do think it's part of the education, you know, because a lot of people don't understand even what public means, right? And so for me, I think I'm willing to invest my time in making this podcast because I care about these issues. But it's also just trying to like widening the net for people like In Jung Kim to understand like where we've been and where we're going. I'm just really grateful to DX Film Festival for inviting us to have this conversation. I've never had this kind of wonky data conversation before regarding our project. So I really appreciate it. You know, also Jenny and Richard, just like your insights have been super helpful. And of course, it's always amazing to be with Sabrina.
Ditto to all of that. Thank you to DX Tech. Thank you to you guys. And I'm forever inspired by my sister colleague Grace here. So I don't know how she does it all.
That's what we do. I mean, honestly, like if you want something to get done, like ask a woman of color. So
yeah, we sure definitely do it all. It's like filmmaking, researching, graphic design.
Sabrina made that flyer. Sabrina actually, she also moonlights as a graphic designer. She made the flyer that we were talking about. She has all these skills.
Just check it out. It's beautiful. Wow.
Thank you for having me. This was, again, really outside of my usual orbit, but I was really grateful to be a part of this, and I learned a lot, and yeah, hope to hear from you. Thanks.
And we'll talk later. I mean, I know the types of people that can do the fast, 10, 15, 25 out of, I would say a lot of Asian Americans have done well in Silicon Valley IPOs in the last couple of years. So, make sure to reach out to me too. Okay.
You will.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.